So Psykers are Warhammer 40,000's version of mages. A little bit different of an approach, though. Rather than these kind of erudite elves and fanciful mysticism fairies, Psykers are more in line with a Force-sensitive in, say, like the Star Wars universe. You know, this kind of this being that's unaware of their potential and completely stumbling upon their own abilities. And I think a better parallel would actually be the mutants from maybe the Marvel universe, but more on that later here. The Thousand Sons Legion, led by Magnus the Red, master of the 15th Legion, is full of no shortage of the talented individuals drawing their power from the very maelstrom, twisting and utilizing warp energies at whim. So today we're going to go deeper into the dark and tragic history of Magnus the Red, and it takes a good deal of time to get for him to get in the Horus Heresy series of books, you know, always talked about with this kind of wide, sweeping language pertaining to his presence and, well, his hair. Seeing as how, you know, I have none, I would pay close attention to that fact now, wouldn't I? But either way, we're going to go into the Crimson King's upbringing on the planet of Prospero and his eventual rise to the Primarch and fall, or ascendance, depending on how you're looking at it, to the Demon Prince or Primarch of Tzeentch. So we talked a lot about how the Primarchs are all far-flung to the distant portions of the galaxy, you know, to these remote planets with no real memory of their birth or anything that would link them to the Emperor. And this is entirely different, though, with Magnus. As a result of being the most gifted of all of his brothers in matters of the Immaterium, Magnus is highly attuned to the psychic world, with a deep connection to his father in the world beyond flesh. And the Cyclopean giant, as he is known, found his home on the remote colony planet of Prospero. Now, this is one of the first Primarchs we're going into that wasn't born on a tragic death world fighting against the planet itself. But at the time, Psykers were looked at more as mutants than as gifted individuals, and we sort of hinted at this in the very beginning we were just talking about, but they were quite shunned by the rest of the human race and regarded with a good deal of xenophobia and fear. And landing in Tizca, the City of Light, the baby Primarch grew to be a gigantic Primarch in only a handful of years, and, you know, again, something we're going to see with every single Primarch. And he was taken in by the ruling class and scholars of Prospero, being taught the psychic abilities of his wards. Now, like every other Primarch on every other world, he quickly masters the lessons that were taught to him and consumed even more knowledge that was yet unknown via the many books in Prospero's mighty librarium. And after rising above the rest of Prospero as the most skilled of Psykers, he led a campaign against the Sinuine, really kind of a hard word to announce there, but these kind of roving psychic predators that stalk and hunt anyone outside of the major cities. Once Prospero itself returned to a world of relative peace, Magnus was elevated to the leader of all Prospero, you know, rebuilding the civilization of the planet. Now, there was this big sort of cataclysmic event that eventually wiped out the majority of the cities across the planet, and that's what Magnus really took to rebuilding those cities. And Prospero as a whole pulls a lot of influence from ancient Egyptian iconography and architecture, even their pantheon, their you know, kind of like a pantheon. So you have these kind of sprawling pyramids, these mighty obelisks, and all manner of towers kind of dotting the landscape. And Prospero, again, as a whole, is this serene paradise of knowledge, learning, and psychic abilities. And Magnus went so far as to construct a great library in the heart of Tizca, making this grand repository of knowledge. But with all of these great things, there's a bit of foreshadowing. Magnus had started to delve pretty deep into the Immaterium, you know, trying to discover more and more from the great ocean and the primordial creator, the Prosperan names for the warp and the chaos gods respectively. And his teacher, Amon, kind of warned him pretty extensively. Definitely one of those scenarios of staring into the abyss too long and it staring back, which is one of the most haunting classic quotes I can think of, next to ass so big you could fit a cup on that booty. Songbird of our generation, E40. But when the Emperor eventually discovers Prospero, there's this kind of telling of how Magnus deals with this. And it's vastly different than almost any other rekindling story that we hear about from any of the other Primarchs. And all these origin stories, the Emperor has to do something, or there has to be an event that earns some trust, or whatever situation that presents itself. You know, we took a look at Lionel Johnson, kind of wasn't as crazy as some of the other Primarchs, but we look at Leman Russ, and Leman Russ challenges him to a fist fight. Or we take a look at even Mortarion, and Mortarion's like, yo, I'm not going to join you until I finish my job here. And even Angron's a little bit of the same too. So there's no real kind of, I guess, proving himself kind of situation that goes on here. In the case of Magnus, actually, remember, they could commune through the warp. Father and son kind of embrace as if one had just been away, at Primarch College, learning how to do a beer bong of knowledge in front of all the other wild Prosperan scholars. I don't know how kind of frat he's in, but whatever. But from here you get this sort of golden era for Magnus. This is the culmination of his being. Magnus has this kind of grand image of a psychic race, a sort of ascendance, where people have become overly enlightened. And he's at the forefront of an army of his sons, the 1,000 Sons to be exact, and we'll go into them in just a second, but fighting alongside his father, who's teaching him more and more about the Immaterium, but also the perils therein. And it's important to note here that this is exactly the ideal that he's kind of chasing after. The Great Crusade is all about bringing a secular Imperium to man, and through that secularity, it does kind of negate a lot of the chaos ruinous powers that we'll kind of talk about in a little bit. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, as I tend to do, but that's important to know. This is kind of Magnus's magnum opus, but for the most part, this is what he's wanted the most. For this legion itself, though, the 15th Legion was rampant with gross genetic mutations, and that they shared in Magnus's psychic abilities because of the gift imparted by their gene seed. And remember, their gene seed is pieces of biological code, I guess you could say, that matches every single Primarch. A little bit of their Primarch is ingested into each and every one of their Legionnaires. But this often led to grotesque and disfiguring mutations across the entire Legion, known as the flesh change. Some other Legionnaires have the same thing. We talk about the Space Wolves have their Canis Helix, which we'll talk about way later in the video, but we'll go into that as well with the Space Wolves, and even the Blood Angels have their Red Thirst. So there's always kind of little catch to their gene seeds. But the name 1,000 Sons is even rumored to have been because the Legion only had 1,000 members when Magnus was discovered. And this is where the kind of slippery slope begins for Magnus, as it does for all of our Primarchs that fall. And their fall to chaos really beginning far before they even consciously chose the path. Rather than disbanding the Legion, the Emperor allowed Magnus the opportunity to fix his Legion. For 100 years, he toils trying to find a cure for his sons, and finally he was able to stabilize the gene seed and eradicate the mutations across the Legion. The cost, though, was more than Magnus knew. He made what he thought was a simple bargain: his right eye for the power to prevent his sons from devolving into beasts. What he did not know is that he was actually making a pact with Tzeentch, a pact that would further send Magnus down the path of relying wholly on his psychic abilities. And you can see how this would spell doom for Magnus, but not quite yet. Enter the Great Crusade here, and after the 100-year period it took Magnus to rebuild his forces from near extinction, the 15th Legion finally joins the Great Crusade in the Emperor's name. And their use of psychic powers were ideal in bringing the subjugation of planets swiftly with as little bloodshed as possible. And as the 1,000 Sons swept across the stars, Magnus devoured the local sorceress and mystic traditions of the newly capitulated systems. And this kind of adds more and more forlorn knowledge to the grand librarium that's decked each and every ship of the Legion. It's kind of this kind of crazy fleet where, the Emperor's Children, which we'll talk about, has these grand artisan-like ships where all throughout the ships there's these mosaics and these statues that either they are crafting or their human counter, or their human not crew members, but their human entourage, I guess, like remembrancers and the such. They're crafting stuff all throughout these Emperor's Children's ships. And you've got the world eaters. All of their ships, they're fighting and all the crap through it. So each one of these ships takes on pieces of their Legion in and of themselves. In this case, the 1,000 Sons turn their ships into libraries. Why the hell not? But throughout the Crusade, the Legion fought alongside a multitude of their brothers, the Space Wolves, Death Guard, Word Bearers, and more. And with this, a good deal of skepticism and outright real disgust started to arise from the other legions. The further that the crusade pushed from Terra, the more horror other legions witnessed at the hands of the Immaterium, really. In the first book of the Horus Heresy series, Garviel Loken of the Luna Wolves, that's Horus's legion, encounters a demon before they even know what a demon is. And this is a repeating theme across the galaxy as more and more of this starts to come to light. And Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Vikings, Space Wolves, and Magnus almost come to blows over the matter, right? Russ outright damns Psykers and their practice as unclean mutations. And this is where the beef between the two really begins. The real big irony, though, is that the rune priests of the Space Wolves practice a real great deal of shamanistic rituals, which is Russ is just entirely okay with. Yeah, you can be a mage over there, you bastard, but we're going to be over here with our scrying devices and throwing bones into bowls. Whatever. But even the Grim Death Guard, completely shun Magnus as Mortarian's upbringing on Barbarous, which we've talked about was ruled over by the psychic warlords living in the Poison Fog. And the Raven Guard, Imperial Fists, they kind of lend their voices to this objection of the way of the Psykers. And the legions go so far as to demand a sanction of the 15th Legion and expunge them in the same methods as the other two legions that we've talked about that were completely destroyed. And we still don't know what happened with those two legions, so I just kind of scantily mention them the same way the books do. But it's important to note too here that there are other librarians, like the librarian thing, I guess you want whatever you want, brotherhood, is still in the other legions. Like the Blood Angels have their own Librarius legion, sect. The White Scarves have something similar to it. They're weird air storm magic or whatever, and they're only really having the bigger problem with Magnus with his pretty much rampant use of it. Almost his entire legion can use it. Well, majority of them. But this leads to the Great Council of Nikaea. And I've deliberately held back on talking about this in the other videos thus far because it has the most weight and effect on Magnus, I'd say. The Emperor kind of calls forth all of the Primarchs to the planet of Nikaea to discuss the future of how the Great Crusade will deal with and treat psychic abilities. Now, you've essentially got Magnus alone here, arguing for the use of psychic abilities as a boon to the Imperium, something that should be cultivated, controlled, and educated on, not something that should be shunned and looked for with a suspicious eye. Other Primarchs speak in his defense, but really not as vehemently as the opposition does. And I mean, you can even Jagatai Khan actually speaks up for him, saying, "Hey, we do it. We summon storms and stuff," but Leman Russ and Mortarion really lead the charge here. Mortarion again using his upbringing as evidence of Psykers going rogue and enslaving a populace through their strength or outright power alone. And eventually, unfortunately, I guess, the Creed of Nikaea was passed, and this results in a massive restriction on Psykers across the entire Imperium. The Librarian orders of each legion were officially disbanded, with the Librarians being forced back into the normal rank and file. This causes a great deal of distress for the legions that are already hesitant towards Psykers as a whole. We see this in the World Eaters, for example, and their ability to, their librarians actually commune in, I think it's actually called the Communion. I can't recall 100%, but they do this kind of ceremony where it quells Angron's roiling mind before he goes into a berserk rage. Even the Blood Angels, the other legionnaires, regard their former librarian brothers with a certain arm's length approach. They're very much like, well, you're a Psyker now, and I'm not sure I can trust you. And this backlash is felt the most by the Thousand Sons, who, admittedly, mostly ignored the creed. I mean, they didn't go stomping about casting magical finger lightning everywhere like Emperor Palpatine. Do it. But they did they said, okay, well, we can't do it. And if you don't see us do it, then we're not doing it. That was kind of like the don't ask, don't tell type of approach they took. And what happens from this Creed of Nikaea is chaplains, a nice rank and position, are created within the legion and are infused into every legion to ensure the tenets of the creed are upheld. And this really set the stage for the Horus Heresy and Magnus's eventual fall or betrayal, depending on which side of the coin you're looking at. But again, we're going to enter into the Ulanor camp. Ulanor camp. I'm going to go with Ulanor campaign. And this is something that we'll go into more with Horus, because it's way more pertinent or important to his timeline, just like the Council of Nikaea is way more important to Magnus's, I think. But this is really the last moment in the entirety of the history of Warhammer 40,000 where the majority of the Primarchs are together in one place on the same side. Here the Emperor gives the title of War Master to Horus, essentially giving him full control of the Great Crusade, while the Emperor returns to Terra to complete his secret webway project, which sounds really cool, right? And there's some bitter sentiments amongst people like Lionel Johnson, but again, we'll get into that later. But this is where Big Maggie starts to, starts his downward spiral. As he meditates on Prospero, he witnesses a vision of what is to come to the Imperium. He essentially sees the entirety of the Horus heresy unfold, with Horus at its helm, driving a spear through the heart of the Imperium. Take that literally. Take that as the Emperor. But funny thing about premonitions in the Warhammer world, and something we kind of discover from the other Primarchs that share in this ability, like Sanguinius kind of has a little bit of it, well, kind of a lot of bit of it, and even Conrad Kurz has a lot of it as well, but this is just simply one future to unfold, not a set definitive result. But as a result, Magnus goes crazy trying to warn Horus, but finds that he's already in the throes of being corrupted on Davin, not Star Wars Davin, via the mortal wound that he sustains. And from there, Magnus really panics, so he reaches the next best person, Papa Emperor, and summoning his kind of chief sorcerers, he tries to commune with his father all the way on Terra via astral projection. While trying to connect with his father, though, he realizes that a number of psychic wards are set up to block and guard Terra. And as he hurls through the Immaterium, he is tricked by a seemingly benign entity who wishes to give him, the power to break the ward, into Holy Terra that would allow anything to go through Terra. But in doing so, Magnus essentially gives the Immaterium free access to Holy Terra. And you can understand why this would be, as critics would widely regard as, a bad idea. The Emperor was basically trying to wean the Imperium off of the use of warp travel. And the warp is where the ruinous powers reside. And if they can be done away with, then a truly secular empire can exist. And this would alleviate the use of the Astronomicon, the Astropaths, and the Navigators as well. And without any knowledge or belief in the ruinous powers, they sort of cease to exist. It's a very interesting dichotomy that the books kind of bring up, because they seem powerful outside of it, but at the very beginning of the Horus Heresy, they don't have the ability to directly interact and influence man in a physical way. They can only kind of nudge things here and there and try and put doubt and fear into people. And that's what kind of builds up their momentum and power as the Horus Heresy unfolds. But the Emperor wants to use the Eldar's webway to connect all of the planets of the Imperium without the need for interstellar, quote-unquote, travel via the warp. So Magnus's intervention undoes all of what the Emperor had accomplished up to this point, and immediately, in his eyes, in the Emperor's eyes, marks Magnus as a traitor trying to, sabotage the ideals of the Imperium by directly violating the Creed of Nikaea, and brings ruin to Holy Terra. He's basically saying, here you go, demons, have at it. And Leman Russ, who already hates Magnus, is then dispatched to bring Magnus to Terra to answer for all of this. And it's important that it's to bring him to Terra to answer for all of this, not to kill him. Now here's where the things get very dicey. In the early portions of the heresy, no one really knew that Horus had fallen from grace, except those on his side. So he, who speaks with the Emperor's own voice, the War Master, commands Leman Russ to destroy Magnus instead. And around this time, Tzeentch appears to Magnus and tells him that it was he, the great changer of ways, that was manipulating Magnus's actions this entire time, from the breaking of the seal all the way down to giving him the power to stop his legion's mutation. Magnus was pretty upset by this. He thought he was pragmatic, or at the very least altruistic in his approaches, trying to better not only his legion, but the Imperium as a whole. He was not willing to play into the hands of Tzeentch anymore, and realized that Leman Russ's inbound fleet was actually a way to knock out two loyalist legions. And Magnus wouldn't have any of that, and he actually went to great lengths to ensure that this was a pretty quick victory for the Space Wolves. He didn't warn any of his forces. He sent the fleet of the Thousand Suns away from Prospero and actually put a psychic veil over the planet, so that his legion could not, foresee or scry any of the happenings outside of the planet. And when the Space Wolves came into the system, they came with a vengeance, pummeling the worlds from orbit before making planetfall. Their wild howls filling the air as they slaughtered both Legion and Prosperan civilian alike. Now, the Thousand Suns were caught completely by surprise, as the Space Wolves hammered on the psychically shielded Tizca, capital of Prospero as we know. Magnus began to really reflect on the damage wrought by his brother, by Leman Russ. He might have broken the seal and violated the Creed of Nikaea, but this was really, if you think about it, not the punishment that he deserved, nor his people. I mean, Leman Russ is butchering women and children, innocent people that are not legionnaires. And at that, Magnus, in his anger, really took to the field and started to turn the tide with his massive psychic abilities. And there's this pretty epic moment in this clash where the consummate warrior squares off against the consummate sorcerer. Magnus and Leman Russ get into this titanic duel, with Magnus seemingly having the upper hand using his strength and psychic abilities, but Magnus even punches Russ, straight open chest shots him right in the heart. Hits him so hard that it punctures one of his hearts. And Russ, in turn, kicks Maggie right in the eye. Whole one eye thing, Cyclopean. And then breaks his back over his knee, full Bane style. And in that moment, before it all really ends, Tzeentch comes to Magnus and offers to not only save him, but his legion, knowledge and his people as well, preserving Prospero if Magnus were to pledge his soul to the services of the ruinous powers. Magnus, unfortunately, does so. His entire legion, himself included, vanish. They kind of fall, they get sucked into the earth of Prospero to reappear in the Eye of Terror on the planet of sorcerers, Sorciarius. Now, it's important to note here that Magnus did not willfully become a traitor because of some slight against him or some self-perceived injustice, Magnus was trying to do what he thought was right for the Imperium. So in a lot of ways, he was manipulated and cheated the right and just that he probably deserved. We've all seen movies where people, they see the future and then they try to prevent that future. Like, it always comes to fruition, right? Because of their actions. Bit of a paradox, right? Because if you do something, you cause it. If you don't, does that inevitably cause it? Well, the way I look at it is that Horus sent the Space Wolves to Prospero with the intention of wiping out both legions. But I think Tzeentch knew that would unfold just as it did. Magnus the Red ascends to become the first actual demon Primarch, really imbued with the might of Tzeentch. The other ones get corrupted and they get some mild possession, like Lorgar, or actually even, I'm going to talk about it, Fulgrim. He goes down a wild path. Even Horus get imbued with a lot of the might of the ruinous powers, but no, not nearly as much as Magnus here. And from here, though, Magnus really sits out the rest of the Horus heresy, guys, to be totally honest. He talks to Jagatai Khan and tells him that he has to choose either Horus or the Emperor. But even then, he's really not necessarily very anti-Emperor in the sense that, hey, you should hate the Emperor, he did this to me. It's more of a remorseful conversation than a, hey, he beat me like a whipped dog and I'm on the Hawaii of sorcerers here. It's a very, very cool, interesting part of, I think the book is Scars. I've read so many of these damn books, I can never keep the name straight. But it's when Chagatai Khan comes to Prospero and he approaches him Magnus approaches him in a natural projection and talks to him and saying like, hey, old friend, things aren't going to be the way they were anymore. I'm sorry. It's kind of actually really sad to read because Jagatai is all sorts of filled with turmoil. He doesn't know what's going on in the Imperium. He's trying to make heads or tails of it. Everyone seems like a traitor. And Magnus even says, don't trust anyone. Find out the words from our dad yourself, but don't trust anyone until you do. So it's definitely not the kind of like wistful Erebus of the word bearers who's kind of like whispering sweet honey into everyone's ear trying to corrupt them. It's a lot more of like a reach your own conclusion, as I reached mine. A lot of tragedy in that, I think. A lot of tragedy. But after the Horus Heresy, things seem to get worse for the Thousand Sons. The majority of the corruption or falling happens for the other traitor legions at the beginning, you know, just sort of spans their lifetime. Not so much with the big 1K sons, you know. We take a look at the Death Guard. The Death Guard are corrupted and they become the Death Guard, Plague Marines, immediately, and that's the way they are for the rest of their life in the 40K universe. The Thousand Sons aren't what they become until we get into what we get into. Like they become they become a traitorous legion, and they stay a normal legion up until this point. So when Tzeentch brings the entirety of the legion to the planet of sorcerers, he also brings back the rampant mutations. Because if there's anything that he loves more, it's constant change. We get it, you giant birded asshole. But enter Ozek Ahriman. Now he's essentially every other legion's equivalent of a first captain, the closest advisor to Magnus up to this point. He sets out with a secret council of sorcerers to effectively stop the mutation by whatever means necessary. And his plan backfires. You know, he invokes a grand incantation that backfires horribly, turning all 1,000 sons that aren't psychers into living automatons, and bounds them to their power armor, hence where we get their special rule, all is dust, as they are literally turned to ash and hermetically sealed within their armor, and their souls are just trapped within. Magnus is pissed. He goes to town on the sorcerers until Tzeentch kind of jumps in and forbids him from killing Ahriman. You know, he says, he notices, you know, hey, he's a good tool, and he'll be, well, he is a tool, and he is a good tool, and he'll be used to other machinations to come, really. And Ahriman, Ahriman, I guess is probably it's Ahriman. Love to hear how you guys pronounce it. There's so many different pronunciations of these things, so always love to hear what you guys say. But Ahriman, whatever, is then banned from the planet of sorcerers and doomed to travel the galaxy, searching for deeper meanings to chaos. And in the earlier editions, Ahriman is seen as more of a tyrannical and evil character. You know, he's got this sort of like, oh, you're a terrible sorcerer. Third edition kind of makes him out to be this terrible sorcerer practicing all means of torture and experiments on individuals. In later editions, though, he becomes a little bit more of an anti-hero, and we see it's really crazy to see both the transformation and the evolution of Ahriman in the Thousand Sons Legion. And it's kind of just a little aside because he does play a huge role in it, obviously. Now, there are a lot of goings-on with the Thousand Sons across the years, and I don't want to get into each and every one of them, but I do want to touch on one I do want to touch on is the Battle of the Fang. And this is pivotal, really. It's the first big incursion of Magnus into the material world since the Horus Heresy. And it's around like the 32nd millennium, so not too much time has passed. And he's had a small appearance here and there, but this is his big campaign, you know, his big coup de grace, by luring the Space Wolves to the remote planet of Garum through an extensive game of Wolf and Sorcerer, known by its lesser cousin, Cat and Mouse. Magnus attacks the Fang, the stronghold of the Space Wolves on Fenris. And his aim is to eliminate the wolves. It's not to eliminate the wolves themselves, but to eliminate their future. Basically, he lures the entire chapter at that time, it's called a chapter at this point, to Garum, and then basically appears on Fenris. The entire Legion is not aware of it. But he destroys the gene banks and all the works of their priests. And Magnus effectively stems further growth of the Space Wolves into successor chapters, becoming the sole heirs to Leman Russ. So that's important because almost every other chapter, Dark Angels, Blood Angels, don't even want to talk about how many the Ultramarines have, but most of the founding chapters or legions have their own successor chapters now. The Space Wolves are one of the very few who have, I think it's only one. I think it's the Sons of Fenris or Sons of Russ, I can't remember. I think they actually added a second or third in some later editions, but they are themselves the smallest of the founding chapters, and a lot of it is because of Magnus just going in there and unplugging things like a petulant child. But in addition, he undoes all the work done to the Connie's helix that we talked about. And this is the gene that's responsible for the Wolfen curse that befalls select space wolves. It turns them into space marine werewolves, basically. And Herrick Ironhelm, the Great Wolf at the time, was killed by Magnus, but not before delivering a kind of series of grievous wounds that Bjorn the Fell-Handed would capitalize on to defeat the Demon Primarch and end the Battle of the Fang. But from here, there are a number of other books, not to mention the Ragnar Blackmane series, where Magnus and the Thousand Sons take center stage again and again and again. Those are kind of minor and don't do a whole ton to further the story between the two, because they fall within the editions where the stories got kind of a little stagnant. But in 8th edition, we see Magnus coming back. He's now back. He's now a model. He's now got rules. For the first time in the history of Warhammer 40,000, he's in Warhammer 30k. You can play him in 30k, but in 40k, it's the first time he's come back. And there's some crazy events that happen. There's a siege of the Fenris system, which basically enables him to bring Sorciarius back into the material world. So that's an important point of... There's a lot more detail there. There's obviously a big battle between the Space Wolves that goes down, as it were. Logan Grimnar eventually kills, it's quote-unquote kills Magnus, because he is a demon. You can't just easily, pop him off. And that ends everything. But basically there's an exterminatus, so a giant campaign to kill off an entire planet, which allows him to bring the Planet of Sorcerers into the material world. That's the big takeaway from the Siege of the Fenris system. But there's another portion of history that's important here. And I'm going to try to save most of this for Bobby G, for Robert Gieman himself, because I think it holds more importance to his timeline and his 8th edition timeline. But basically, after Bobby G is resurrected, he goes on what is called the Terran Crusade. He summons up a bunch of the successor chapters of the Ultramarines, and he makes headlong for his father. He's going to talk to his father for the first time in 10,000 years. He's going to heart to heart, a corpse to thing. But Magnus intercedes a bunch of times here. He pulls Robot Bobby G into the Immaterium. They get captured. They get freed by Cypher, and they go through the webway with the help of some Harlequins, and they get all the way to the moon, actually. And this is where Bobby G and Magnus have this titanic duel. These two are just going at it, and clearly Magnus has the upper hand. Bobby G wasn't known for his great martial prowess the entirety of any portion of the Index Astartes or anything else that would make us think, oh yeah, Bobby G is going to win this one. Magnus, on the other hand, is infused with demonic power. He's a Primarch and he's a Psyker. He has too many one-ups. But with the aid of the Sisters of Silence, which create a psychic null field, no psychic ability works around them, they basically cause the defeat of Magnus. And again, I will go into that way more when I talk about Bobby G, because there's a lot more significance of how this is fought, how all the Harlequins play into it, and it's better saved for his timeline because it plays more heavily into why and how he's resurrected. But that concludes, I can finally take a breath now, but that concludes the entirety of Magnus the Red and what we know right now. There's probably going to be a lot more that's revealed in the 8th editions as it progresses, and as we hear more Primarchs that come to the fore. But hopefully this gave you guys a really good idea of Magnus's upbringing, his life in the 30k, and his life in 40k now. If you have any questions about Magnus the Red, or anything that you want to say I pronounced wrong, please, by all means, let me know. But please make some comments, stir up some conversation here. I always love having conversation with you guys about, hey, this is not what I learned. I learned this, this, and this. A lot of my knowledge comes from 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 7th and 8th edition. So love to kind of talk to you guys about that progression as their stories kind of evolve. Like we talked about Iron Man and how he went from being a dickhead sorcerer to a pretty good anti-hero for the Legion. But thanks for watching here today, guys. Have a good one. We'll be doing more of these as I drum up the knowledge to go through all of the Primarchs. Love to hear which ones you want to hear about next. Magnus was pretty high on the list, so I did a good fan service here and wanted you guys to have Magnus before the year's end as kind of a happy new year to all of you. And for those of you guys, this should be coming out here right before the new year. So if you guys are going out and having a good time for the New Year's, please be safe. But other than that, guys, have a happy new year. Thanks so much for helping me get to 10,000 or so subscribers, just about there. Still on that long trudge upward, but again, it's all thanks to you guys. But have a good one, guys, and take care.